What's up, everybody? Eric Messersmith here. Everybody settle down. A quick post-election show. I was thinking about what to say. What do you say about this election? So I'm just going to give some random thoughts in no particular order. First of all, I was wrong. I said last week that I thought it would be very close, and I thought Harris would win the blue wall states plus Nevada. Of course, she did not. It looks like she's on track to lose all 7 of the swing states. Most of them have already been called. It looks like Trump's going to win them all. And the margins, although they've gotten closer, were surprising to me, especially in the popular vote. It looks like Trump is going to win the popular vote. He's up by, as I'm recording this, almost 4 points. She's going to close that with some mail-in ballots from California and other places. But still, he's going to win the popular vote, becoming the first Republican president to win the popular vote since 2004, and only the second since the 1980s, which is crazy. I did not expect it to be that big. I won't say a blowout, but that big of that decisive of a victory, called that early for Trump. I thought that whoever won, it would take a while and we wouldn't know right away. So my prediction was wrong, although I did say I didn't really have a lot of confidence in it. The margin surprised me. Look, this is a political realignment. Donald Trump not only has completely taken over the Republican Party, but now his coalition is transcendent. And look, you got to give him credit. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, disappointed in the outcome, but you got to give him credit. He put together a working class coalition. It was mostly working class white people, but he looks like he did fairly well with black people, particularly black men, maybe around 15%. We'll see what the final exit polls say. 15% of the black vote. It looks like he got around 40% of the Hispanic vote, which is very, very good for a Republican. And again, he has turned it into a working class party. Now, in practice, do the policies actually back that up? Not really, I would say, by and large, but certainly the rhetoric is of a party and of a movement that is working class. And that is a realignment, because for a long time, that was the base, the backbone of the Democratic Party. And so we'll see what happens with the actual policy, but I think that part at least is clear. Now, in terms of the reason, what explains this, I mean, look, a lot of it is obvious. Prices going up 20% over a 3-year period, but I think even bigger than that, it was immigration. I think that kind of 1-2 punch, I think, was just too much for Harris to overcome. I think it was one of the main reason Biden's approval ratings were so low even before he had his senior moment at the debate and dropped out. It's just tough when you're running as the heir apparent to an administration that has a 40% approval rating, as Kamala Harris did, where 2/3 of the country say that we're on the wrong track. And look, inflation is one of those things where it went way up. It's gone back down to basically normal levels now. But that was to a large extent out of Biden and Harris's control. It was mostly driven by COVID, and also to some extent the money that both the Trump and Biden administrations gave people during COVID, because the world, was shut down. But immigration wasn't out of their control, and that's why I think that was even more of a death blow for Democrats than inflation, because we saw this summer when they instituted reforms on the border through executive action, the numbers went way down. They could have done those things 2 years ago, 3 years ago. They chose not to. They chose to instead try to pass legislation, which I agree with passing legislation for the border. I think we need comprehensive immigration reform. But when it was clear that wasn't going to happen, rather than step in and say, hey, that's not going to happen, let's lock the border down as best we can for now, because we have this massive flow of people. It's straining our resources. It's causing problems all over the country where we don't have housing and infrastructure for all these people. Let's lock it down for now as best we can and try to fix it legislatively while we do that. And not doing that, I think, is the single biggest mistake the Biden administration made. And I think it is, if not the main reason, certainly one of the main reasons they lost. The other thing, and I've said this before, is Biden himself. He deserves a ton of blame for not stepping aside earlier. In 2023, he was 80, he's 81 now, so he would have been 80 years old, right? He was clearly thinking about what he was going to do, wanted to run for re-election. But when you're 80 years old and you're thinking about running for a term that's not going to end until you're 86, I think it is incumbent upon you to have some type of structure in place where if you're slipping at all mentally, cognitive ability declining in the least, that somebody or a group of people can tell you, hey, look, you need to step aside. Clearly that didn't happen. Biden didn't have anything like that set up. He didn't recognize it or didn't want to recognize it in himself. And then we saw it play out in the debate. And look, I think you should give Harris a lot of credit and her team. I think they pulled together a pretty good campaign for having 102 days or whatever it was to basically do everything from scratch with almost no infrastructure. But it put them in a tough position. And had Biden stepped aside in 2023, when he clearly in hindsight should have, one of two things would have happened. Either Harris would have won the primary, in which case she would have been an even stronger candidate. She would have had all of the stuff that they needed to do when Biden stepped aside, all the logistical stuff, raising a ton of money, vetting vice presidential candidates, getting ready for a convention, rolling out policy proposals. All of that nuts and bolts of running a campaign would have already been done for her. She would have had the reps of going through debates, interviews, some of them hostile, and she would have been a more prepared, I think, better candidate. Although I don't think she was bad, but in the short time she had, but I think she would have been better positioned to maybe win. And also, had she not won, that would have shown you that somebody else really earned it. Somebody like my personal favorite, Josh Shapiro, or maybe Gretchen Whitmer, or maybe Gavin Newsom, or maybe, who knows, Pete Buttigieg. They would have taken it away from the incumbent vice president, who probably would have been endorsed by the president, Joe Biden. So that person then would have gone in, again, with all of that campaign infrastructure set into an election against Donald Trump. And either way, however it would have shaken out, it would have given Democrats the best chance to win. So I think this is, look, I've said I think Biden, in terms of the legislation he passed, was a consequential president. In terms of steering us from that very high inflation and the economic downturn of COVID into a place where we're in pretty good shape now economically, especially compared to the rest of the world. I think he will get a lot of credit for that. But I think a lot of it is overshadowed by the fact that his decision, he didn't have to run. His decision helped lead to a person who he thinks is a threat to some of the norms of our democracy and will try to at least undo a large part of his legacy. Now, how successful he'll be, we'll see. So I think there's a lot of Democrat blame to go around. Look, I think for a long time, working class people in this country felt left behind. Starting in the 90s with NAFTA, the trade deals, which overall had some big benefits to our economy, but there were losers there. And it was a lot of these small towns and a lot of these factories. And so it wasn't just all trade deals. A lot of it's technology. A lot of it's just the way the world is moving. But because of our trade policy, because we really failed to address in a systemic way income inequality, because of wars that had gone bad, Iraq mainly, I think there was a sense that we needed something different and we needed a new form of politics. And I think Donald Trump is very shrewd, and he saw that and he understood at a gut level how to communicate and connect with those people. And that's not all of his base. There were other people, but by and large, that's the group he excelled in. I mean, we'll get the final exit polls, but he's going to win non-college educated whites, probably 2-1, people without a 4-year degree. And rural areas, you saw the numbers last night. I mean, he dominated, racking up huge margins in these rural areas all across the country. Now, he did a little bit better in some urban areas too, but he was still losing those places, 80-20. So it's not like he was all of a sudden getting a majority there or close to it. His base is largely what it was in 2016 and 2020. And he understood that, and Democrats deserve a lot of blame for that, for not having a message that resonated with those people. And I think there's going to be a lot of soul searching for the Democratic Party about how they let the working class voters, which if you look at policy, Trump has changed the party to make those policies a little bit more favorable to working class voters. But by and large, still, the Democratic policies are more advantageous for those people, but the messaging is way off. And also, I think the cultural issues really matter. And I know that look, the issue about the trans stuff, particularly the ad that Trump was running about Harris saying in 2019 that she would support conversion surgeries for people who are in detention, who are illegal immigrants. I think Bill Maher said this a few weeks ago. Like, that is just kind of a litmus test issue. It's not really an issue. Like, I don't think there are even any cases of that actually happening. But if you can't just say, no, of course I don't support that, it makes you look crazy. It makes you look out of step with most people in America. And I think that kind of stuff, the DEI stuff, the for lack of a better term, woke stuff that Democrats, I think, really got caught up in, especially during that 2020 primary campaign when Kamala Harris was a very active candidate and supported a lot of positions that in hindsight looked pretty outside the mainstream. I think that hurt the Democratic Party culturally with a lot of these working class voters who around the country just said, you know what? I'm not really down with that stuff. And it gave an opening to Trump. I think probably the biggest textbook example of that is trans girls playing sports in high school and college. And there's not a ton of that happening, but there are some examples. Leah Thomas was probably the most famous one, the swimmer, but there's a trans female volleyball player now in Division I sports, where some of the other universities are forfeiting their matches rather than playing against her. And Democrats can't really just come out and say, you know what, it's probably not a good idea for biological boys to be playing high school and college sports against biological girls. Like, rather than just come out and say that, which I think the vast majority of the country agrees with, they've either said the opposite or they've hedged and not really answered the question. And again, it's a litmus test thing. It's not the biggest issue in the world. It's not the most important thing by any means, but it is something where people kind of look at you and on a gut level say, you know, if you're not with me on that, I don't know if I can really trust your judgment, right? And so I think Democrats have to take a hard look at some of those positions. It doesn't mean you have to throw the LGBTQ plus community overboard by any means. It just means on certain narrow issues, you can use a little bit of common sense. And I think that would go a long way for Democrats. They have become too much the party of the elite, and people don't want to feel talked down to. They don't want to feel like they're racist or sexist or homophobic just because they disagree with you. And I'm not saying all Democrats are like this. I'm not even saying Kamala Harris is like this, but I'm saying that vein became strong within the Democratic Party over the last, 5 or 10 years. Now, I think it is dissipating to some degree. I think that it maybe reached its peak a year or two ago, but I still think that kind of stain was on the Democratic brand, and it was really tough to get that off. And then you throw on top of that the problems with immigration. You throw on top of that the prices going up by roughly 20% over 3 years. You throw on top of that just kind of an unstable feeling about the world, even though American troops aren't involved in a lot of these fights, or any of these fights really. You've got Israel at war with Iran's proxies. You've got the war in Ukraine with Russia. And democracies around the world in a post-COVID era, the party in power, by and large, is getting crushed. People just have this sense of unease. And so I think you combine all of that together, and it doesn't surprise me at all that Trump won. The margin surprises me, but it doesn't surprise me. On a positive note, we counted the votes quickly. That's good. No major challenges. I mean, hell, we already have, I think I looked today, 140 or 50 million votes counted and processed. Most of the states have been called. I think we did this a lot more efficiently and effectively than we did in 2020, which makes sense. No COVID this time. Also, I think this just kind of puts to rest this idea that you can't have a fair election with mail ballots and with early in-person voting. I mean, we've seen there's no sign of any kind of irregularities. Also, we have a losing candidate who's actually going to concede. As I'm recording this, Kamala Harris hasn't given her speech yet, but she's scheduled to in a few hours, and she's apparently going to call and concede to Donald Trump privately and publicly, which is what we should do. Unlike, by the way, what Donald Trump did in 2020. I heard some of his supporters last night talking about why hasn't Kamala Harris conceded yet? This was late last night before some networks had even called the race, and I just wanted to put my head through the wall. I mean, how you could have the gall to sit there and question Kamala Harris not conceding when the race still hasn't been officially called by some outlets, less than, what were we at that point, 6-7 hours after the polls had closed. And on the other side, you literally have a dude who hasn't conceded an election he lost 4 years ago and tried everything he could to overturn it. That is just bananas to me, but it's a sign of the world we live in. By the way, speaking of that, what a political resurrection for Donald Trump. I mean, love him or hate him, the man was left for dead after January 6th by me and by many other people. I just thought there's no way. Like, he's done in politics. And somehow, some way, he came back. And I think it speaks to several things. It speaks to misinformation by some parts of the media that just spun and came up with these alternative narratives justifying some of his outrageous behavior, including related to the election on January 6th. But I also think it speaks to his skill at what I was saying earlier, the ability he has kind of like on a gut level to connect with certain demographics and certain group of voters. And you can't deny the guy's work ethic. I mean, he never really left the spotlight. He's been doing rallies for years now leading up to this election, even at 78 years old, doing a lot of interviews. By the way, credit to his campaign too. That I think everyone agrees this was the most professional campaign operation he ever had. They knew the voters they needed. They knew how to target them, particularly men. They went on podcasts, Joe Rogan and many others. They went on Twitch streams. They specifically focused in on that demographic. Young men of all races. It was mainly young white men, but they did, it appears, pretty well with young black men, young Hispanic men, compared to what Republicans typically do. They knew the voters they needed. They knew how to connect with them. They had a strategy, and despite sometimes Trump's best efforts to throw it off message, they did it. And they were good at stunting too, like the McDonald's thing, the driving the garbage truck just in the last few weeks of the election. Those kinds of things got him into the news cycle in a way that was positive. People looked at the McDonald's thing and thought, oh, that's funny. You know, he's there handing out fries in the drive-thru. He handled that situation well. Driving the garbage truck, highlighting the idiotic comment Biden made, where I think Biden, if you watch the video, clearly was referring to the comedian who made the joke about Puerto Rico as garbage. But what he actually said is Trump supporters are garbage. And that was a idiotic thing to do. I don't think it swung the election by any means. I think Biden, there's a lot more blame for other things for Biden. Like I said, the decision not to step away being the biggest one. In terms of where do we go from here, I mean, look, I think one of the more interesting arguments I have found from Donald Trump supporters, both that I've spoken to personally and also that I've seen on TV, is a weird argument that is he's not really going to do the things he says he's going to do. He's not really going to deport 15 million people. He's not really going to impose a 20% across the board tariff. It's just a negotiating tactic. He's not really going to abandon our allies like Ukraine and NATO and just kind of let Russia do what it wants. He's not really going to cut trillions of dollars from the federal budget and decimate programs that, you know, millions of Americans depend on, including a lot of his supporters who voted for him. He's not actually going to do those things. He just says he's going to do them. I mean, maybe. I think there's a chance that is true. I think it's a hell of an argument to make for a political candidate you support. But I think Trump is in many ways an empty vessel. I think he kind of points generally to things he likes, like tariffs and cracking down on immigration. But the details, I think, are usually either left to other people or left to decide depending on the whim of how he feels in the moment. So I think it is an open question as to what he will try to do. I hope he does not impose a 20% across the board tariff. I think it would be devastating, again, particularly for low income and middle class people, many of whom voted for him. I think deporting, look, he wants to deport people who arrived here recently. I'm on board with that. I think we need to deport some people. Deporting people who have been here for 10, 20, 30 years, who have jobs, who have children or grandchildren who are American citizens, who work in our in critical industries like building homes, the service industry, I think that would be a terrible mistake. And I actually don't think he'll do it. I think it would be logistically and financially a massive undertaking, and I don't know that he actually will do that. I think he'll deport some people, but I don't think he'll do mass deportations. In terms of what he'll do legislatively, look, the Republicans are going to win the Senate, but the margin, it looks like it's going to be 53, 54 votes. And they're probably going to win the House, but the margin is going to be really small. They're going to have 4 or 5 votes like they do now. Those kind of margins are not conducive to passing, major sweeping legislation. It's going to be really hard, particularly with the filibuster still intact in the Senate. So we'll see what Trump does if he has trouble getting things through Congress. Does he just try to do everything through executive order as much as he can, even if the courts may strike it down later? Does he pressure the Republicans in the Senate to end the filibuster, which is something Republicans have been adamantly opposed to before, but now the shoe is on the other foot. They're in the majority. Maybe he could do that, because a lot of his agenda to get lasting impact, he's going to need to get it done through legislation. And he didn't show really any ability in his first term to pass major bipartisan pieces of legislation. There's probably a deal to be had on immigration. Like, Trump could probably make a deal that would secure the border, but also give a pathway to citizenship to some people, not everybody that's here illegally, but some people. But does he have the discipline and the skill and the interest to try to do that? I don't know. He hasn't shown it in the past. Maybe he will show something different now. Is there a big budget deal? Social Security and Medicare are in trouble financially. We have this massive deficit. Is there a deal where you could do some spending cuts combined with some tax increases to raise revenue, to lower the deficit? I think that's a deal we're going to have to do at some point anyway in our country. But does Trump, again, have the skill and the discipline and the patience to do these things? He hasn't really shown that. So it's going to be tough, I think, for him to pass major pieces of legislation, even with Republican majorities. But one thing he will be able to do with the 53, 54, 55 seat majority in the Senate is he'll be able to get confirmed his cabinet nominees, judges, if there's a Supreme Court vacancy, those things I think he will be able to do. And look, there's a lot of things you can do as a president through executive order and through running the agencies of the government, and through foreign policy and through trade policy that don't require congressional approval. So he is going to have a lot of room there to try to take that as far as he can. And in terms of some of the more outlandish stuff, again, he's threatened to pull licenses for media outlets he doesn't like. He's threatened to use the Justice Department to go after political opponents. He's threatened to fire people in the government, career civil service people, experts, scientists, engineers, if they're not sufficiently loyal to him. I don't know if he'll do any of those things. Again, a lot of his supporters say, oh, don't worry about it. He didn't really mean those things. I hope they're right. I hope there are enough Republicans who can hold him to account inside and outside of his administration, who will kind of temper some of those more outrageous elements of Trumpism. I don't know. Our institutions held once when he was president. I think, fingers crossed, we can do it again, but it's going to be up to those Republicans in his administration to kind of rein him in a little bit. And also, it's going to be up to the Republicans in the House and Senate. There are still moderates left, not as many as there used to be, but I'm thinking in the Senate, Susan Collins from Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, maybe Todd Young of Indiana, Cassidy from Louisiana. Like, they are going to be critical. They are going to be able to, if they band together, rein Trump in, at least legislatively. And same thing in the House. There are enough moderates in the Republican caucus in the House that they will be able to block legislation that goes too far. So the pressure is going to be on them. It's going to be very intense, but they're going to have a lot of power to kind of moderate Trump. And look, I'm an optimist at heart, so I guess you could make an optimistic case that if Trump is moderated and doesn't do a lot of the crazier things he said, and he really just kind of focuses on trying to big picture fix immigration or maybe our structural budget issues, and he's willing to compromise, that maybe there is a path forward to make some of those things better. So that's kind of the optimistic case. I don't know if I totally buy it. I don't think I do. But again, Trump in many ways is an empty vessel. And I think nobody knows, even his supporters, even the most hardcore of his supporters, I don't think really know what he's actually going to do or be as president in his second term, when he doesn't have to worry about running for re-election again, when he's able to handpick his loyalists, his cabinet. He's not going to make by the same what he thought was a mistake the first term of bringing in establishment types who might try to constrain him. When you have a Congress that is going to be mostly more deferential to him than certainly it was when he ran again. You have a Supreme Court that now has a solid conservative majority and will probably let him get away with or let him do most of the things that he wants to do. It's a different world than it was in his first term. So those are my kind of initial thoughts, not necessarily with a ton of reflection. Charlie and I will do a show later in the week. We'll get more into this and maybe what it means for the future and what a Trump presidency might look like, and hell, maybe even 2028. J.D. Vance is certainly on the clock now as the heir apparent. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Also, I think we can put the rest of the idea of what would happen to the Republican Party. I was saying in our shows leading up to the election, that if Trump lost again after losing in 2020 and having two successive bad midterms in 18 and 22, that maybe the old Republican Party, the establishment Republican Party that was more pro-immigration, more pro-free trade, more pro-interventionism, maybe that party would come back and at least have a fighting chance to reclaim what it means to be a Republican. I think that is now obviously completely dead. I think that element of the party now is gone. And you never know. Maybe it makes a comeback at some point down the road. These things tend to run in cycles. But I think for the foreseeable future now, this election has cemented that this is the new MAGA, is the new Republican Party, not just for as long as Trump is here, but I think this election means that post-Trump, it will remain the MAGA party. And I think J.D. Vance is positioned very well now to be the nominee in 2028. We'll see what happens. But if he's not, I think the next most likely person would be Ron DeSantis, who, for all intents and purposes, is now, in that MAGA tradition. I think the party of Mitt Romney and John McCain and George W. Bush and Mitch McConnell and Nikki Haley even, I think that party now is gone forever. I think we are in a new political order. One other thing, again, trying to be positive, I do think there is an opening for Republicans and Democrats to work together on some things that maybe in the past you wouldn't have thought. China is a big thing. Obviously, I think there's big consensus now, or a big consensus within both parties about the threat China poses and how we need to deal with that. I think because of what Trump has brought, at least in his rhetoric, about helping the working class and maybe using government in a way that Republicans wouldn't have done in the past to help make the lives of ordinary citizens better, I think there's some overlap there with some things Democrats want to do. Now, we'll see. Again, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to actually propose legislation to do it. Trump really hasn't done a lot of that, but I think there is an opening to work together there. So we'll see what happens. It's going to be a wild ride. Charlie and I will be back later in the week with another show. Thanks for listening. Make sure you like and subscribe. Everybody settle down.